Welcome to Energy Unplugged, your go-to podcast on the global energy transition. I'm Oliver Kerr, Managing Director of Aurora's US business.
And I'm Hugo Batten, Aurora's MD for APAC.
Today, we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Nat Bullard. I suspect Nat needs no introduction, but for those of you who've been hiding out over the past few years and haven't heard of him, he spent most of his career at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, including several years as Chief Content Officer. He's now the co-founder at Halcyon, an AI-assisted search platform that helps those navigating the energy transition. He's also the author of the fantastic annual presentation on decarbonisation that I'm sure nearly all of our listeners are familiar with. In fact, I think I saw it described online recently as something like the energy sector's equivalent of Taylor Swift's Eras tour. So high praise indeed. Nat, a very warm welcome to Energy Unplugged. It's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Oliver and Hugo, thank you both. It's a treat to be here, and I'm still cringing at the Eras tour thing. I actually honestly don't know what to make of it. I will say this, it took me less time than the Eras tour did to put it together, but maybe not by much.
Well, Nat, before we get to the presentation, can we start with Halcyon and just tell our listeners what it is and how you built it over the last couple of years?
Sure, of course. So, as you said, I spent 15 years in the research business, just covering things in energy transition. And one of the things that I discovered is that there were all kinds of things that I wanted to be able to do. The technology was not really ready for. There were things that couldn't really happen at platform scale, or the capability wasn't there. The technical talent in terms of people in engineering, the technical talent in terms of what is available at the frontier wasn't there. What I wanted to do was really get not just into the structured side of data that, Aurora, for instance, handles so well, but the unstructured side of information. So for those out there who are not as enmeshed as the three of us are in this stuff, structured equals things that are tabular, things that are highly formatted, things that generally are able to flow in a really structured way. Unstructured is text. It is transcripts. It is filings, dockets, rules and regulations. And what I found is I was very fortunate in the last couple of years to find a team of people who had the capability to make all of that unstructured information into something that we can access with great scale, with a lot of speed, and also with a lot of scope. So really, the company is the brainchild of Bruce Falk, my co-founder and the CEO, a team of engineers with platform experience, large language model and machine learning experience at places like Twitter and Roblox, a team of people as well with data science experience, who basically looked at all of the stuff that I kind of would say were on my dream list for things to be able to do 10, 15 years ago, and it was just impossible. And it's pointed in a direction that I think has been a little bit underserved, which is paradoxically information that is already public. So all of the things that we work with, and we're just looking at the US at the moment, and we have yet to expand our corpora to cover every state. But what we're looking at is things in the public utility, public service, public corporations commission realm for the most part, a few things from the federal side. But really the information that is actually, call it the informational plumbing of building anything in the world of decarbonization. You want to build transmission, it's going to be going through this sort of commission process. You want to get rates approved to build batteries or to do wildfire mitigation, it's going to be going through a docketing and a proceedings process. And you both know, we're talking about in any one of these discrete things, tens of thousands of pages with perversely complicated information architectures, and architecture actually I should be using that in air quotes that you can see here that our listeners will have to imagine, and with very low interoperability and with very low replicability. So you can spend, and this is no shade, people spend decades and make entire very good careers out of just understanding the metaphysics, if you will, of one regulatory body in one state. And that's great, but it's not information that has been encoded into software. And that's really like our hope, is that using LLMs and data science that you're able to do that. And to view this as not just one-off kind of work that feeds specific discrete inquiries that people have about this particular rate case or that particular asset, but more something that applies across the board to a lot of inquiries at once. Two, I guess is another way to say it is you can go with great verticality, with great depth, really deep into something like an integrated resource plan, or you can go quite broad and ask using a data science approach the same type of question across dozens or hundreds of different discrete jurisdictions or proceedings to dig in a little bit there. So that's the near term. There's a longer term too, which is to build a real platform business out of this. You both know this very well. I think the term gets bandied about, and I think oftentimes, let's not say abused, but let's say massaged into the shape that people want when they're talking about their business. But as you know, a real platform is a place wherein other things come to do aspects of informational business or transacting. So, what we want to do is to be able to put layers of interoperability and capability together so that you can put structured and unstructured information together. You could bake all the processes I've just described into your own business processes through an application programming interface, through an API, and also to be able to just work with an interface with all kinds of other workflows that people have. And that's a couple of things. Like, we've been doing this for about a year and a half now. We were pretty quiet about it, and then we're doing our best to be as public as we can about it. What's fascinating for me as a person who's not deeply expert inherently in large language models or in machine learning is the things that are easy and the things that are hard, right? So prompt engineering is tricky. Both of you know, I'm sure, from using Perplexity or using ChatGPT, staring into the open context window is difficult. People have the expectation of it's a magic machine. It will give them what they need, regardless of how they ask. That's one thing. Another is that deliverables, I think, have been fascinating for us to sort of walk through in terms of what people are looking for, which is that even with lots of citations, a wall of text is not great, right? So, as we work with our partners and our initial customers, we spend a lot of time thinking about what we can build that not only is informationally rich, but is also workflow useful, like workflow integrable and things that you can plug right into what people need to do. A little bit of a mouthful, but hopefully that gives a bit of a vision on what we're up to.
Yeah, super interesting. And you said that you were starting in the US initially, but I'm doing a lot of work in markets like the Philippines and Korea, and it feels like the need for the services you are describing are even more acute there. And I know you're in Singapore, so you probably have visibility into some of these Asian markets where, again, the architecture in inverted commas is even more challenging.
No, listen, 100%. I think one of the challenge and the opportunity both is that you want to focus initially in places where your learning is replicable. So wherein we can take what we learn in the United States and apply it to other parts of the United States. There's a technical element at work here called a knowledge graph, which is understanding the interrelations of particular entities. So how do LLCs roll up to a top company, for instance? How do subsidiaries of companies interact with each other and with the parent company? And this is the kind of work where it benefits to embed a little bit in a market. Whereas I'm picturing right now, if we were to go to Philippines, we would need to know and rebuild a little bit. How does Energy Development Corp interact with Ayala Corp, for instance? You can use that sort of stuff that is specific and non-abstract. But I think the hope is that also where you can devolve more and more of this to deeply encoded abstraction that works at a deep level that will help you go faster when it comes time to go to one of these new markets. But to be honest, right now, we're busy enough in the US. It does have 50 states, and then it's got federal layers. And within those states, too, it has, overlapping foci within a particular regulatory body. Sometimes they regulate water or sewer, transmission, telecoms, and everything. Sometimes they only do electricity. And then you've got places like, again, I keep returning to California, once a Californian, always a Californian, but you have both a Public Utilities Commission and an Energy Commission, and sometimes they do similar things, sometimes they don't. You have a Department of Motor Vehicles that looks after part of how autonomous vehicles work in California, Public Utility Commission that works after the rest of what happens in autonomous vehicles. There's so much density and richness, to put it in the polite way, that we need to navigate it first, I think, before we get ready to go and expand. But it's definitely going to be part of the plan. The hope is we not just learn a lot about a market, but develop capabilities from one market that can then be applied to another.
I couldn't agree with that more, Nat. I mean, power markets, in contrast to global commodity markets, are inherently local to a degree. And certainly coming from a European context and having spent the last 4 years in the US in Austin, Texas, it really feels like the disaggregation of decision making and data leads to a market opportunity for those who can aggregate it and make sense of it in a smart way. Just to broaden this out a little bit, though, I know that this is a really tough one to answer, but you're using AI in your business to help folks advance the energy transition. To think more broadly, what do you see as the major impacts that the AI could have on the energy transition over the next 10 years or so?
That in and of itself is a topic that I think could keep the three of us busy for hours, if not days. But if I can do it a speed run fashion. One is the demand side. I mean, we've seen in all of our markets a return to an expectation of pretty significant electrical load growth in even developed and what had previously been pretty electricity stagnant economies, like, for instance, the US. And we're talking about places where it might be rather challenging for many different reasons to build. And so you've got this sort of new concentrated source of electricity demand at a scale that is a little bit new. I mean, not a lot of economies have been used to, besides maybe China, connecting discrete 1 gigawatt loads routinely within a relatively small, dense area. The other is that you have an unusual kind of customer. So the normal buyer of electricity in 100 megawatt chunks is probably something like an aluminum smelter or a foundry. And they're going to be highly, highly price sensitive to the input price of electricity in terms of informing their output. Whereas, at least on the training level for models, the electricity component of training a big AI model right now is somewhere between 3 to maximum 6% of the cost of the model training. So it's, and to borrow Andy Lubershain from EIP, Energy Impact Partners, words on it, energy is everything and energy is nothing. You both really have to have it, but you're pretty insensitive to the cost of it. For reference, the cost of R&D, which is obviously technology, but also people and the equity cost of people, is somewhere between like 30 and 50% of training a model. So it's a very unusual dynamic that we have on the demand side. And then on the impact side, what can it mean in terms of, or supply side, if you will, in terms of what does it mean for AI? Well, just think about all the different things that we are already, both myself and my team at Halcyon, and what you're doing, I'm sure, internally, to leverage these tools to just make your work more efficient in the service of further down the line decarbonization goals. How are you going to use this to speed up your acquisition of knowledge or your processing of it? How are companies going to use these things to more quickly run through planning and permission cycles? That's on the kind of what we think of as like the generative AI side of things, where you're dealing with what most people today would view almost as like the consumer version of AI. Then there's all the other stuff. I mean, there's things like AlphaFold, which helps us much better understand how millions of proteins assemble themselves, or work that Google and Delta and MIT have done to think about how airlines might better track so that their contrails have less of a radiative forcing impact on the atmosphere. So lots of stuff, I think. And if we end up in a position, which I'm reasonably confident we're heading towards, which is that we view this as a general purpose technology, then it's all the like third, fourth, nth order things that come in and out of this that end up being really interesting. And to be fair, it's not sort of necessarily within our gift right now in year 2025 to know what those are going to be yet.
I think that really rings true, and especially since the DeepSeek announcement, those second, third, fourth order effects feel really important. You reduce the cost of something. What is the impact of that? You have a really nice chart in your report. I think it's from the IEA, where you show that globally, load growth from data centers pales in comparison to things like air conditioning, broader electrification. Do you think that holds true in the US too?
No is the answer, because we at least have gone through our big wave of cooling build, for instance. And in fact, as people become more efficient, as you get more and more efficient, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning equipment, we may not have some massive return to like cooling demand as the big driver of growth. In fact, one of my other slides I have is the forecasts of load growth have been really fascinating because in our time, all three of us, the US has gone from expecting a higher growth in summer peak than in winter peak to now the opposite, a much higher expectation of winter growth than summer growth. I shouldn't be quite so glib. We do have a lot of manufacturing being built in the US, or at least we have a lot of intention to build a lot, and there's a lot of capital construction going on. So there are other things that are drivers of it, but we in the US are not really looking at, say, desalination as a big driver of electricity demand. And the industry question there is going to be interesting to see what is our industry composed of. Most of what the IEA says is that it's light industry, not heavy industry. And then in the building sector, it's like more cooling than heating. So we'll see. I mean, we're not going to have quite so many drivers of other kinds of demand as other parts of the world. And then look, on the EV side, really honestly unclear. That's, I think, more of a question mark now than it would have been, say, 3 to 6 months ago.
I think that's right. And it's general. I saw a graph the other day which showed demand since 1940 in the US, and it's remarkable to see just how flat it's been over the last 10 years, which is, I think, important context for the conversation we've seen recently around expectations for growth. And it's generally really tough to calibrate expectations. On the one side, you want to be wary of buying into that hype and taking sort of ISO forecasts or some of the third-party studies at face value. But on the other end of the spectrum, I do think it would be naive to buy into the sort of Luddite skepticism of the naysayers. It's just genuinely hard to find a middle ground on this.
It really is. And if I can add just like a little bit more on that, it's really fascinating to see kind of at the regulatory / societal level, how it is that we begin to negotiate this. One of the things that I covered quite closely, both with Halcyon work and then again in this deck, was looking at some of the smaller service territories in Virginia. Virginia already has like a quarter of its electricity going to data centers. And they're going into places that they're now expanding out rather from the data center alley, which is in Dominion service territory. Dominion is an enormous utility, into electrical co-op territory, like Northern Virginia Electrical Co-op or Rappahannock Electrical Cooperative. And these are places that are not really prepared, and they're very open about this for just what might be coming, at least in terms of the intentions of hyperscalers. So I'll give you like a little quote. Rappahannock's got about a 1.2 gigawatt summer peak load. And in a filing that they put together late last year, they said that with their new data center customers, some of which may be up to 4 times the size of our existing system peak load, they might have trouble accommodating that kind of growth. And to your point, Oliver, it's not just how do they accommodate a growth if somebody wants to build 3 1 gigawatt data centers in a complex in an area. It's also what happens if they build in anticipation of that growth and it does not materialize. Because you're now talking about a rate base, and you're talking about a customer base that would have added in billions of dollars worth of new infrastructure on the expectation that there will be somebody requiring that and paying you for power service, and then they don't materialize. It could become complex. So there's a lot of stuff that I think a lot of people, if they're not in the kind of policy regulatory markets nexus of all of this stuff, haven't really thought about much yet. And the reason is because they haven't had to. If you wanted to build a 25 megawatt data center in northern Georgia 10 years ago, fine. But now if you want to build a 500 megawatt data center in Mississippi, it might be more complicated.
No, and there are certainly echoes of the 1990s and at the time expectations of huge load growth and CCGTs built off the back of that. I would say that my favorite statistic from last year was that Loudoun County in Virginia has more data centers installed today than any other country in the world, save from China, which is pretty incredible.
Oh, Loudoun County is another favorite of mine. They have, as of 2024, they have 43 million square feet of permitted data center floor space.
Wow.
And they have 47 million in the pipeline. So not only is it bigger than any other country already, it is at the permission level ready to double.
Yeah, it's truly phenomenal. I think we could spend a whole podcast talking about this, but I do want to talk about the bigger picture. So let's turn to your, the 2025 edition of your State of Decarbonization report. So for those of you who haven't read it, it's a fantastic 200-slide summary that, I think beautifully summarizes some of the key trends that we're seeing in the global energy transition. So Nat, there's an enormous amount of insight in there. If you were to summarize a couple of the key messages that you'd want folks to take away from the 2025 edition, what would those 2 or 3 messages be?
The first one is it was a year of more of everything. Basically, everything that you can think of, there was more of it. There was more consumption of coal and natural gas, oil. There were more carbon dioxide emissions. The atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide went way up. There was more increase in temperature. We saw our first full year above 1.5 degrees C. There was also more electric vehicles built than ever before, more energy storage deployed, more wind, more solar deployed than ever before. We don't have the full data yet, but we'll find, increasing penetrations and share of generation mix for wind and solar. We saw in markets like Texas more battery storage that basically completely absorbed the regulation up and regulation down market in the Texas power market. So many of these things that basically like everything happens so much, basically, like everything of every sort is happening. That's one. The other is that I think we can say that a lot of the climate, the sort of abstract impacts of a warming climate are becoming much more apparent in basic everyday life, in a sense. So you have things like extreme precipitation events that are just completely outside of the frame. Your listeners in Europe will remember the flooding on the 29th of October in Valencia in Spain. Not only did they get 771 millimeters of rain, this is like 30 inches for Americans in 24 hours, they got more than 7 inches of rain in 1 hour. They got more rain than in any year since 2008. And in fact, they got more rain than the years 2021, 2022, and 2023 combined in 24 hours. Like, that's not great, right? We had heat events all over the world, but you have heat events that are now literally becoming materially significant financially. Like in India, for instance, there are instances where the Indian Stock Exchange is obviously tracking the mentions of anything that's being said. And there were 80 mentions in the second financial quarter of the year about heat waves. So basically people say, I run a public company in India and heat waves are significant enough for me to have to talk about them in terms of what it means for my earnings and my business. So we've got a lot of that kind of stuff going on, becoming really apparent, I think, in real life. Floods, droughts, high temperatures. And to me, at least, they just don't feel that abstract anymore. They feel pretty much direct and concrete. But then the final one, and this is always the challenge, is you sort of have to squint hard to look for, if not moments of inflection exactly, then moments where things are flattening out. And this is something that I try as best to do to cast a wider aperture than just looking at the US. But like for instance, China's apparent oil demand, which is the statistic that captures basically its refinery runs and demand for product. China's apparent oil demand seems to have hit its peak in late 2023 or early 2024. And that's fascinating because China is the world's biggest oil importer. It imports more oil than the EU as a whole imports. And it's also been the main driver of oil export growth and oil demand writ large globally for more than a decade, probably close to 2 decades. Similarly, China's steel output has also peaked, and I think actually even more acutely than this potential apparent peak in oil demand. So China's apparent steel demand was more than 1 billion tons in 2020, and it's going to be about 850 million this year. And to put it another way, the decline in steel demand in China is almost exactly equal to all of the growth in steel demand outside of China this century. So there's a lot of things happening that could be potentially sort of near the peak that are worth watching for. Like, how do we dance along at a plateau of coal, gas, and oil consumption, or how do we move past that? And these are questions that are, I think, most acute, Hugo, for you and me in the region here, rather than for the EU or the US.
Well, maybe let me jump in there, Nat, because I again agree with you. And I think some of the dynamics in Asia are just not always fully understood. And again, there were so many brilliant slides, but just to pull out a couple of examples, I mean, there's a great one on global coal consumption. And while it's plunged in the West, it's been more than offset by growth in India, ASEAN, and China. The peak demand growth in places like the Philippines, and you pulled out India. I think Indian peak demand is up 100 gigawatts in 10 years. And then he talked about, potentially peak Chinese oil demand, although it's hard to tell exactly from the stats. First question, do you think these kind of Asian dynamics are sometimes underappreciated? And what's the long run impact of that?
I think they're completely misapprehended for people not in the region. People just sort of don't get that there's a lot of energization, full stop, to do across the region here. Whether that's more vehicles, more road transport, whether that's more scale and electricity consumption. I mean, I don't think that there are places in the region that are still significantly under electrified, really anywhere, even including like the Indian subcontinent has done an extraordinary job electrifying. But there's an under provision of power. Like it's available, but not nearly at the volume that we consume or that China consumes, or Japan per capita, for instance. I feel like that's not people just don't really get that. And they don't really get that actually a lot of things that we did go through a wave of in the US, such as, building in the Sun Belt and air conning everything, is barely starting here in this region. But especially as we are in a much hotter, littoral and equatorial location here for almost all of the population centers, of course, we're going to have loads of air conditioning, and that's going to drive power demand. The one thing I can't say is that it is a region that is much more accustomed to growth. I'll never forget one of my trips when I was still with Bloomberg, went to see the National Power Authority in Malaysia. And as an aside, they tossed out that they had just commissioned 2 coal plants that day, which had not happened in my career in the US. And not only that, was just sort of like, that's what we do. Like, we build power plants because power demand is growing. And so I think that there's just a lot that people don't really look at. It's easy to construct a narrative out of the EU being one thing, the US being similar but different, China being its own thing, and then just sort of lumping the rest of the world together, or I don't know, just not really giving it sort of the attention that it deserves. But part of my hope is that these are also places that are highly capable of real innovation in terms of what gets deployed. And let's figure out what works, at speed and at scale here. We've got work to be done. Let's put it that way.
You talk about, a lot of the physical stuff, coal consumption, renewables build, et cetera, but you've also got some great slides on the financing that sits behind these assets. And I may have been misreading this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought there's some really interesting charts about the plateauing and even slight decline in early stage climate financing, but then huge growth in spending on later stage energy transition investments. And is the thesis here that we kind of know we've got the technologies to get to 70, 80% of the way there, solar, wind, battery, EVs, etc. And now the push is on scale and deploy, or is something else going on here?
Part of it is that, the asset base gets bigger and can easily absorb more money in building physical goods. That's a great thing. We want, we want as much money as possible, I think, flowing in that direction. And so that, I feel like, is sort of like a normal / good thing to be doing, is like more stuff going into technologies that work. But those technologies only cover, really, at the moment, the electricity sector and things that are closely adjacent. Basically, something like 90% of all of the investment in energy transition last year was in electrified transport, renewable energy, power, and the grid. And then there's this long tail of other stuff that's like the next 10% out of $2 trillion of investment. So it's highly sort of tilted towards a couple of things that worked really well. Neutral statement. I think that that's probably fine in terms of what it is. Of course, you want more money going everywhere, but capital markets investors are going to want to send money to the things that actually, for them, are working. But then the early stage stuff is that, like early stage companies need to make money for people. They need to actually return capital to their general partners, who in turn return it to their limited partners. There's what I think is good to see is that there's quite a lot of money, relatively speaking, still available. So there's about $80 billion worth of dry powder, so funding that's been committed but not yet drawn down within like climate tech finance. But even within that, most of it is going towards infrastructure, sort of on the early side. And the VC funding has come off, has sort of come off its peak. But the growth and buyout funding is not quite off, is not quite so far off its peak. So we're in a situation where it's a little bit nuanced. And I will say, especially the early stage is wrapped up in many other things at once, which is, for one, the cost of capital. Now that we have a return to positive real rates around the world, that it impacts the sort of risk-adjusted return expectations of any big institutional investor, and in turn that propagates downwards towards what's happening in venture. There is a little bit of a difference, I think, regionally. I mean, we'll see what happens this year in the US, but Europe has still got a pretty strong market for climate investment. We see as well, like, a fair amount of interest, I think, in some of the specialist funds still being raised in terms of a share of the total amount of money being raised in venture, which is good to see. Like that's a really healthy thing. But all of these sectors have to work within market realities. Like at a certain point, they have to work. They have to either be in a market or make a market for themselves.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, you mentioned the US. I think probably aside from data centers, the question I've spent most time fielding over the last few weeks is impact of the new administration on energy transition. One thing I'd really love to get your take on, having read the report, is what do you see as the impact of a couple of two trends that feel like they're moving in opposite directions? So one is manufacturing overcapacity globally, particularly for things like solar and batteries, versus a general push, and especially in the US, for the onshoring of supply chains and geopolitical tensions increasing across the board.
It's a tough one, because one structural planner's overcapacity is another buyer's low-cost input, right? And in particular, wherein you're competing on the economics, not just the sort of planetary merits of doing a technology, then cost and quality are winners in their own rights. I'm sympathetic, sort of in an ideal world, any developer is going to say, give me the highest quality, lowest cost thing that I can get. The challenge is that so much of that is highly concentrated from one particular seller, it's China. And it's in many cases upstream of that, controlled if one way or another through the process by entities within China in terms of processing, or in terms of say something like solar. It's not just modules, it's like wafering capacity is almost entirely in China. And so like there are strategic reasons to not be so overexposed to a particular market like that. I will say that if you want to obviate that overexposure, though, it takes real concerted effort to do that. And it has to exist, I think, not only at a policy level, but as a kind of national goal. Like, okay, yes, we're going to, at least initially, either pay more or use less of something in order to build up national capacity and maintain it. But you also want a commitment in order to maintain it. It's a hard sell to build this sort of capacity and capability and then not use it. I will say that I think the U.S. is in a probably preferential position because it is simply so big as an economy that, like, there will be a market. There will be a market for this. And the U.S. has the institutional financial state capacity to kind of extend itself towards supporting what it feels like it needs to do for diversity of supply chain or for onshoring or whatever. But not every country can do that. Even countries with a population, let's say in the range of 50 million, might find this to be a challenging proposition.
No, totally. Australia's got its own Future Made in Australia program at the moment, and I am deeply skeptical about that. I think the US and China and maybe one or two others get to pull that off. I'm not sure Australia does.
It's not like Australia is a tiny economy, and it's not like but it's also not like it's underserved with goods and services. But what's the de minimis here? Like, what's the sort of smallest economy that can afford to do the future made in Australia? And then how can it go about accommodating that through all kinds of other things? Because Australia, as far as I can tell, is probably not the cheapest place to buy industrial electricity compared to other markets, or natural gas for that matter.
Totally agree. I mean, hopefully listeners can tell the deep well of admiration that Oliver and I have for Nat's deck. So maybe one kind of final question, Nat, on this. And it is a bit inside baseball, but how do you prep the report? Are you just like through the year squirreling away little ideas and working on it? Or do you lock yourself away for December and just rip through it? What's the creative process here?
It's a bit of both. So I basically have a big hairball of a presentation that I will dump things into. Sometimes it's like a screen cap of a table. Sometimes it's a link, or it's a series that I saw somewhere, and I just throw it in there. I usually don't add any other information besides a citation so that I can get it again and things like that. And I try to let the process be as sort of like undriven as possible for about 8-9 months, just seeing what's there. So for instance, I had well over 400 of these by the end of October. And then you sort of start the Fortress of Solitude process of beginning to kind of create the master narrative out of several other larger narratives. And at that point, it's interesting because at that point you start shaving off clearly loads of stuff. Some of them you shave off because they are no longer relevant, or you shave them off because they were sort of point source, if you will. You're unable to track down the rest of the data that goes with it, or it wasn't a trend, it was just an occurrence. I also then rather enter this point where I start to then become proactive, not reactive. So there are things that I'm looking for. I'm looking to go find a data set that speaks to what's the difference in inference energy consumption for different parts of generative AI. And that for instance is, fortunately, that one was fairly easy to find, but it's the kind of thing that is challenging to do because you may or may not be able to find the answer. And what I hope for is that usually by the end of December, I've got like an idea on kind of where the master narrative is going. And then what I keep trying to do is to pull it closer and closer to the start of the year, wherever possible. So basically have it ready to go by mid-January. I was literally waiting on just one thing that kept me from publishing on the 20th of January. It was worth it. It was worth waiting for it. But these things go stale the moment that they've been baked. So basically, the better I can do to get it done early, the better for everybody involved.
All I can say is that I hope our research team is listening to this. I think it'll be required listening for all our new joiners this year.
You can make them all build a 200 slide deck of their own. I will say it's also highly personal in the sense that like people ask who works with me on this. Some people have been kind enough to offer data along the way or help me with a particularly intractable kind of concept. But I do it all myself. And I think that's part of how I hope it's part of how it feels like part of a coherent whole as well. Even though it's very kind of junior analyst manual to do it all in certain aspects of the work, it's still, I think it still helps it feel like one person's narrative.
No, for sure. And for those of you who haven't read Nat's report yet, it is online and available now, and I highly encourage you all to go away and take a look. Look, we'd love to continue this conversation for a lot longer, but I think it's time to wrap up. But before we do, I'd love to ask you 3 quick fire questions. So the first is, what is one hypothesis or view that you have on the energy transition that you think is perhaps at odds or out of the general consensus?
I love that question, and I'm taking a minute now to think through it. What I would say is that I think that we're going to have a harder time in the near term and an easier time in the longer term, which is, I think, probably not how most people view it. I think we have a lot to negotiate and navigate in policy, markets, some elements of technology in the next 5, 6, 7 years. But I think after that, we'll be in a more apparent position to tackle a lot of big problems. I feel like the technological capabilities we are building right now that are still nascent, in many cases still unformed, are going to be potentially transformative in the 2030s. And my hope is that the 2050s look and feel better than the late 2020s. Let's put it that way.
That's great. And I think that really gets to my second question, which is reading your report, and I think just more generally, it's sometimes really hard for me, and I think for probably a lot of our listeners, to calibrate levels of optimism on climate change. You've been putting out this report for the last few years. Do you have a sense of which way your optimism is trending?
I like that too. I mean, I just think of myself as being very observational. Like I'm just trying to capture the clearest view I can of the present moment. And then I think people should feel free to interpret that in whatever way they can. I'm optimistic about this. I'm optimistic about the stuff that right now is working well and pretty hopeful that we'll keep it going. I'm a bit surprised, I think, at the robustness of the kind of underlying base, so to speak. Like if you were to go back in time to 2007, which is the first year that I was really doing this kind of work, and you said, two things are going to be happening in the year 2024. We're going to install 600 gigawatts of solar in 1 year, and it's also going to be a world record year for coal consumption. I would be really scratching my head and trying to figure out what happened. Like I wouldn't possibly be able to interpret how that came to be. So, I'm not sure that that's a particularly like satisfying answer. I think what I try to do is to keep my realism and observation as strong as possible rather than kind of tilt one way or another.
Thanks, Nat. And a final question before we wrap up. I think there are very few people who follow this sector or this topic in as much depth as you do. Is there anyone you read or listen to in the energy space that you think is reliably good and thought-provoking that you would recommend to our listeners?
So I'll give you the good reads, I think, and you'll probably find them interesting because they're not all entirely just like the sort of energy observers you would think. So Dr. Sasha Gioni from Hugging Face, who does all this fantastic work on the energy and environmental implications of AI foundation models, is awesome. And my friend Susan Su, who writes Climate Money and is at Boba Capital, does these nice sort of thorough deep dives into technologies and markets. The other is Hannah Ritchie, who writes for Our World in Data and has obviously a very data-driven approach to thinking about all kinds of big challenges for the future. I really like Andy Lubershane's work in the Steel for Fuel blog that he writes or Substack that he writes. And Julio Friedman from Carbon Direct, the Carbon Wrangler, also has a great work. And what I like about both of them is that they tend to like dig deep on themes in terms of what they look at, and are really good about raising the next questions that we need to be asking of ourselves. I love Simon Evans' work at Carbon Brief and Zeke Housefather's work as well. He writes for the Climate Brink as well as other places. And I mean, that's a decent number. I mean, I probably got like dozens of others of people that I read. But no, I try to cast a wide net. I try to not just read things that are specific to energy themselves. And I try to read people that, people who are thoughtful and drive us towards more inquiries rather than necessarily just answering questions, if that makes sense.
Thanks. Now that's amazing. And I think we've got our summer reading list for our incoming grad analyst cohort sorted. So much appreciated. I think that's a great place to wrap up. We're really appreciative of your time. All the best. And thanks very much again.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Hugo. It was a real treat.
Thank you.
That was Oliver Kerr, Managing Director of Aurora's US business, and Hugo Batten, Aurora's Managing Director for APAC, talking to Nat Bullard, Co-Founder at Halcyon. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.